Hello and welcome again to Checkpoint Jumpstart Training. In this module, we'll be examining how Checkpoint logging works, how you configure it, and how you can access the log data. So we'll start by discussing deploying, setting up logging, then using the track action in your security policy to determine which rules that have traffic matching them should generate log data and how verbose that log data should be. We'll then take a look at the smart log component of Smart Console, which allows you to intuitively search for and display the detailed log data that is being generated. We'll also look at the functionality in both Smart Console and external applications that permit you to get an at a glance update of the status of your checkpoint deployment, as well as getting more detailed information about your checkpoint deployment. Also, the SmartView web application, which provides a platform independent way of accessing log data. You don't have to have a Windows desktop machine with the Checkpoint Smart Console software installed. You just need a standards compliant web browser. And we'll also demonstrate this, how to set up logging, configure log actions and policy, and then examine log data. Examine the status of your checkpoint deployment, and we'll take a look at the SmartView web application. So, kind of a central theme in Checkpoint is the three-tier architecture, where we have security gateways that are examining network traffic, applying your security policy to that network traffic, determining which connections should be permitted, which connections should not be permitted, or perhaps which connections we're going to allow, but we're going to watch with, say, layer 7 awareness of what is acceptable for this protocol and what isn't. So security gateways are doing that. And as they do that, they're generating log data. The log data is sent securely using Secure Internal Communication, SIC, to a designated log server. And by default, that's going to be your security management server. But in a large deployment, you may want to move that load, that overhead, off of your security management server and have it handled by another appliance. And you can do that. You can set up a dedicated log server. Similarly, we'll take a look at the Smart Event component, which allows you to see event data. That is by default processed on your security management server. That can be a lot of processing, a lot of overhead. So you can deploy another appliance and configure that appliance to be where smart event processing is done. And finally, there's the Smart Console component, which again is a Windows application that connects to the management server or the log server or the smart event server and displays the data that is available, the log files, for instance. So in order to have logging worked, you need at least one log server. Again, by default, that's your management server. And the screenshot to the right shows a management server. And you can tell that it's a management server because it has the network policy management blade enabled. And in fact, it's the primary management server, so there's no option to turn that off. It has to be the management server. And also selected as a feature, a component, a blade, is the logging and status. And if you deploy a dedicated log server, you would configure it to be a dedicated log server using the web user interface first time wizard configuration. Then you would create a checkpoint object to represent that dedicated log server, establish SIC to that appliance, and then in the checkpoint object that you created for that log server, you would select logging and status. And perhaps also you want it to handle smart event processing. So you can select the smart event components. Not going to get into details on that, but there are two: the smart event server, which is where the event database is kept, and the smart event correlation unit, which is pulling log data from various sources, primarily checkpoint log data, but we can also pull in from third parties, and analyzing to see, do we have something here that looks like an event? And that can all be done on your management server, but that's a lot of overhead. So you can offload it to a dedicated log server that also handles smart event, or you can have a dedicated just smart event. Yeah, I think I want to go back. Okay, so cut this part out and we'll go back and we'll start. So as I said, by default, your management server is the designated log server. If you change that, if you deploy a dedicated log server, you have to make sure the dedicated log server has a checkpoint object to represent it. SIC is established. That object has the logging and status feature enabled. And you have to configure the security gateways to override their default setting of sending log data to the management server and instead configure them to send log data to the log server. That's a setting in each security gateway's checkpoint object, and I'll demonstrate that. So logging is automatically set up for you. You don't have to do any additional steps. Your management server will handle logs. Larger deployment, you may want to change that default behavior. Now, we need log data to be generated, and a primary source of log data is your security policy, where we have access control policy with firewall rules, and each firewall rule has a track action. A brand new rule, the track action is set to none, and traffic that matches that rule does not generate a log entry. Generally, that's not what you want. That's not best practice. So what is best practice is to change the track action of every rule to be log. Now, there are always exceptions. For instance, routine, frequent, chatty protocols such as perhaps DHCP or various router discovery protocols, that sort of thing, you may not want a lot of log data generated for those protocols. You may have a rule that either allows that or drops that, and its tracking action is none, because I'm not interested in log data about this particular protocol. And that's okay, but most of your rules should have at least log as a tracking action. And if you select log, Under the More menu option, when you are editing the tracking action of a rule, you have the option of also selecting detailed log and or extended log. And both of those contribute log data just like a log setting does, but they have, well, more information. Information pulled from the layer 7 aware blades, such as application control, URL filtering, content awareness, and that can be displayed in the smart log view, which we'll demonstrate. There are some other options, such as alerts. If you select an alert option, the default is no alerts, then when this rule with an alert action is matched, in addition to creating a log entry, we can also asynchronously alert somebody. So the basic alert option will simply give you a pop-up message. You have to be running the correct Smart Console component to see that pop-up message. So what might be more useful is a SNMP, Simple Network Management Protocol trap, that is configured to alert whatever SNMP management solution you have that this asynchronous event has occurred. We can also generate an email. Now, you want to be careful with that. I don't want to be inundated with tens of thousands of email messages, but that might be appropriate in certain circumstances. And finally, user-defined alert, which actually just runs a script on the host that's generating the alert. And that script can do whatever you can imagine and implement in a script. Gaia uses the Linux operating system. Linux operating system provides, for instance, Bash, the born-again shell, and that can be used for scripting and is extremely powerful. So we can use a user-defined alert to send, for instance, both an SNMP trap and an email message and something else like start the coffee maker. Now to view log data, we start with Smart Console, and over on the left, that vertical menu, we select Logs and Monitor, and that is a tabbed interface. So if we don't already have a Logs tab, then we will click on the New tab and say I would like to see logs in this tab. So this Smart Console Logs view is actually Smart Log, which is also a separate Smart Console application, but it's also integrated here. And it has a lot of different features that make it easy to tune what it's showing you to precisely what it is you want to see. So for instance, at 1, you can have already defined queries saved. Those searches for log data that you routinely do. For instance, I want to see log data about IPS protections that have a severity of high or critical that were detected but not enforced. Or I want to see log data for anti-bot blade log entries that display information about here's an internal host which is sending suspicious botnet related traffic. You can also quickly restrict the amount of logs by a time period. So in 2, you say, I only want to see log data for the last hour or the last 24 hours or since midnight today. And you can be very granular. I want to see log data starting Tuesday at 2 a.m. through Wednesday at 1 p.m. And it will display only the log entries that are within that time period. At 3, the query search bar allows you to further restrict the logs that are shown, and it's natural language search syntax. You can, for instance, say, I want to see all TCP logs from this source IP address to this destination that are HTTP. And that will happen. And once you have a query that's displaying the data that you need to see, if that's something you're going to be doing on a frequent basis, you can save that as a favorite query. Over on the right at 4, you can see high-level event statistics, such as what's the top sources of traffic, of connections? What are the most frequently connected to destinations? What services are we seeing the most? And so on and so forth. And then in 5, well, that's the major part of this view. You can see the results. If you double click or right click and select a log entry, it will bring up a log details window that is packed with information. Now, what information is displayed in this log details window depends on the policy that created or the component that created this log entry, the tracking level that was designated in that rule, and also what happened to the traffic. Traffic that is dropped, we do that with the initial connection, so we never see layer 7 data for dropped connections. Traffic that was accepted, we progress to the layer 7 application exchange, and so there may be more log data. So in this particular screenshot, note at the top left origin, that's the security gateway that contributed this log entry, and then the time of day relative to that security gateway. The blades, the components, the features that contributed to this log entry. And so in this example, both the firewall blade, which is basic packet filtering, stateful inspection, and the application control blade, which allows you to categorize typically HTTP and HTTPS connections based on what sort of website is that? Whose website is that? And product family is just, was it access control policy or was it threat prevention policy that contributed this log entry? Over on the right, you can see the source, host name if known, IP address, source port, which is typically not important. That's generally randomly selected. The security zone of the source, destination, host name if known, IP address, the destination security zone, and then the service, destination port and protocol. TCP 443 is HTTPS. Also the interface in which the traffic was accepted, the traffic was received on. And if we have layer 7 awareness that has contributed to the log data, in this example, the application control feature, then we can see additional information such as this destination, which has the inscrutable hostname LGA15S47, et cetera, is actually part of Google services. That's the application. And so if you have application control policy, you can make access control decisions. Are you allowed to go to Google services or not? And that's independent of the domain name. And that frees you, the security administrator, up from having to research and find out currently what every Google service domain name is, and then create policy to block or allow just those domains. application control knows that information. Also, I'd like to note the matched category. This is URL filtering. So this destination was categorized by URL filtering as computer/internet, and an application risk level was determined to be low. Back to the right, you can see the policy information. The action for this connection was accept. Policy package that processed this connection is the alpha standard. That policy was last updated today, and we matched rule number 6, the outgoing rule. And that's from the name column of the rule. And one final thing, you can't see much of it, but at the bottom left, this traffic was rewritten by the network address translation policy. And so while the source address of the original traffic was 10.1.1.201, NAT translated that source address to be the external IP address of, in this example, a cluster, could also be just a single security gateway. So what the Google services destination received was a packet from 203.0.113.1. And so return traffic from the Google services host will be addressed to 203.0.113.1, and NAT will translate it back to the original IP. So I mentioned that it's a fairly flexible natural language search search query system. So for instance, you can query log entries that are drop or accept or something else based on the action column of the rule that matched. You can restrict your searches to log entries that were contributed by a specific blade. Again, I want to only see anti-bot related logs. You can say blade : anti-bot. Source, destination, port. And if you, for instance, have identity-based policy where you are determining who's the user that is originating this traffic, you can search based on the identity. So show me traffic from user Tom that is the HTTPS protocol that was accepted. So some more examples: searching by a particular user, Richard, searching for an IP address or a range of IP addresses, in this case, a subnet. Show me anything in the 10.0.0 subnet. You can also say, show me anything from 10.0.0.1 through 10.0.0.149. Search for IPv6 addresses, host names. Over on the right, searching for a range of ports. Though note that we overflow here, so that's sort of a bug in the slide. It was just to see if you would notice, because the maximum port number is 65535. Searching by destination or source, you would prefix it with SRC : or DST : to say I only want to see traffic from this source or this destination. You can also say I only want to see log entries where this specific field, such as network address translation or destination hostname, is blank. So DST host : quote, the two quotes, or the empty square brackets designate no data in that field. Another nice feature that Smart Console provides is a high-level overview of the health of your checkpoint deployment. So this will display the health of all checkpoint devices that have SIC established to your management server, as well as the management server itself. And here we can see that there are 3 devices that we have SIC established to, or 2 devices that we have SIC established to, plus the management server. But those 2 devices are part of a cluster. And we're not going to get into clustering in this training, but just briefly, when you have a cluster, the individual components of the cluster are generally not accessed, not configured individually. Instead, you configure the cluster object that contains those individual security gateways. But in this context, it is important to know not only the overall cluster status, but the status of the components of the cluster. So not only is the cluster object displayed here, but the individual gateway objects that are members of that cluster are also displayed. And note the status column on the left. Green circle with a check mark inside of it means everything is good. A yellow triangle means that at least one component, one portion of this checkpoint host has a warning for you. If that status symbol is not yellow, it's red instead, that means that at least one component of that checkpoint host has a critical issue that you need to address. Critical issues could be, I can't talk to it right now because the network is down or that device is down. It could mean that a license has expired. It could mean that it is critically overloaded. I also want to note under recommended updates, there are no currently recommended updates that have not been applied to the 3 checkpoint hosts, the management server and the 2 security gateways up to date. And that's that CPUs component, which is a Gaia level component that on that Gaia host will automatically reach out to Checkpoint and determine, are there any updates that are applicable to this version of Gaia in this role, security gateway, management server, what have you. And so right now, no. You can also see CPU usage. Now there's other things I'd like to know about: network throughput on a security gateway, memory utilization. And you can get that information by selecting one of the lines here, AWA cluster or ASMS or an individual security gateway. And then at the bottom, more information is displayed, more verbose information. So we've selected a gateway cluster, and at the bottom, you get details of a gateway cluster, and you can further drill into the details by clicking on either the license status OK, which is a hyperlink, or device and license information, and that will bring up even more information about licensing or the components of the device. For instance, on a security gateway, if you have the IPS, intrusion prevention blade enabled, what's the status of the IPS blade? When was it last updated with signatures and protections? Now, the SmartView web application is new in R80. To access it, by default, you go to https:// whatever your management server is. That could be a host name, could be an IP address, could be a fully qualified domain name, whatever. You would not literally type in all caps MGMT HOST. Replace with the IP address or host name of your management server /SmartView. And perhaps click through a TLS warning about the certificate of this management host. Once you've clicked through, you'll be asked to authenticate as a checkpoint administrator. And once successfully authenticated, you will see something sort of like the logs view of Smart Console, only web browser based. And this is really handy for instance, auditors or help desk or security analysts who need to be able to see uh, what the current security posture of your checkpoint deployment is, or look at log data. So I'm going to demonstrate the various logs and status views in Smart Console. We'll do some queries. We'll also take a look at Smart Event. We'll look at the various log options as well as alert options and the SmartView web application. I want to show you how to see status and logs in Smart Console. And first, status. If you go to the Gateway and Servers view in the left-hand side menu, you get a quick, easy overview of the status of your checkpoint deployment. So all checkpoint devices, starting with the management server and then including every checkpoint device that you have SIC established with, will be displayed here. And the first column, the status column, you get a green circle with a check mark if that device currently has no critical issues and no warnings. If it has at least one warning, no critical issues, there'll be a yellow indicator. If it has at least one critical issue, there'll be a red indicator. And selecting one of the checkpoint devices displayed will bring up more information down at the bottom in the Summary tab. So for instance, we can see CPU and memory utilization, whereas up at the top half, we only see CPU. It'll tell us if it's a security gateway or a management server or something else. In this example, it's a security gateway, and it has the example code policy installed, and that was done at this date and time. You can also see tasks that were performed on this checkpoint host, and those tasks can be automated through the application programming interface, or there could be something that an administrator kicked off manually by, for instance, right-clicking on the device and going to Actions or Scripts. So for instance, do a backup. And then any errors that have been recorded on that device, and right now there's no data. Back in the Status tab, if you click on Device and License Information, you get a pop-up window with additional details. So on this particular security gateway, there are several features. It used to be called Security Blades enabled. The firewall is basic. That's packet filtering, stateful inspection. It's got to be there. But we've also enabled URL filtering, application control, intrusion prevention, and anti-bot. And all but the firewall feature are going to require occasional updates. URL filtering, for instance, as new websites are deployed on the internet, we need to know what the category of that website is. Anti-bot, as new command and control hosts are discovered, we need to know their IP address. Or new botnet malware may have a different protocol used for command and control. We need to update our signatures to be aware that this is, well, botnet command and control traffic. And IPS, intrusion prevention protections, are updated. New ones are added as new threats are identified. So we're going to need those updates. Now, the green check mark here means that none of these blades are complaining. None of these features have had an issue, for instance, with fetching an update. If the last update did not succeed, then there may be a yellow warning. If it's been a long time since we had a successful update, or we have a license issue or something like that, there may be a red critical marker. Then we also have license status, and this is a virtual lab environment. It's using a evaluation license, which automatically enables pretty much everything, but has a time limit. Then system counters and traffic, really only useful on a security gateway. This allows you to see, for instance, system counters, CPU utilization, memory utilization, hard drive utilization. Traffic allows you to see fairly real-time information on what kind of traffic is moving through this security gateway. And you have other options, for instance, how large of packets are we seeing? Then moving away from monitoring to more logging and status. Under logs and monitor, this new tab, which if it's not displayed, you can click the plus sign here to get the new tab, offers you different views. What view do you want displayed in this new tab? And I've already selected the logs view in a tab. So this is log data that is being contributed usually by a security gateway. And this origin column here will tell you which checkpoint host contributed the log entry. So most of these log entries are coming from my security gateway, a gateway, but there have been a couple from other checkpoint hosts. Typically, log data is generated when a rule matches in your security policy, and that rule has a tracking action. But there can be other reasons why your security gateway or some other type of checkpoint device generated a log entry, including the device restarted, or we have a cluster and a cluster member has fallen out of the cluster, or it's come back into the cluster. Perhaps it restarted or something else happened. So by default, the logs shown here are not updated without user interaction. I can click this refresh icon and it will go out and fetch new log data. And I currently have the view limited to just log entries in the last hour. You can make it last Wednesday through last Thursday if you needed to. I also have a query. I'm only interested in log data that came from a gateway, so not my event server, not my management server, only the specific host, a gateway, and where the service is HTTPS. Only show me log entries that match that in the last half hour, or last hour, I mean. And most of the log entries here are the result of HTTPS connections happening in the background from my Windows host going out to some website on the internet. And I have HTTPS inspection enabled on a gateway. So when an HTTPS connection is received on a gateway, it runs its HTTPS inspection policy to decide, should I decrypt this HTTPS connection or not? Most of the time, yes, decrypt. And that shows up as an inspect log entry. So if you double click on a log entry, it brings up a details window with additional information. For instance, this log entry was a connection out to apparently Google, gstatic.com, which is categorized by my URL feature, URL filtering feature, as computer/internet. And again, this connection was decrypted. The HTTPS inspection policy matched a rule whose action was inspect. So we decrypted the connection. Some of these other views, such as the general overview view, which again you can get by creating a new tab and selecting the general overview. This is not so much log entry focused as issue focused or event focused. So for instance, over on kind of the right-hand top, we have a count of infected hosts, which would be contributed mostly by the Antibot feature. The Antibot feature detects this internal host is attempting to connect out to a known command and control server, or I see traffic that matches known botnet command and control signatures, then that's a host you need to go look at. or IPS or antivirus might be populating the critical attack types. But again, this is a fairly quiescent lab environment, so there's not a lot of data available showing attacks or even just regular traffic. The audit logs view is for administrators. So for instance, it shows changes to your security policy. Rule was created, a rule was moved to a different position, a rule was updated with this source object, and so on. And this is useful for figuring out who changed this rule. Now, there are other ways to do that in Smart Console. This is one way to go back and review, well, how did this change that broke the internet happen? Who did it? What did they change? But also you can see administrator logins, logouts, and other actions. And there are plenty of other views available, such as the compliance view. If you have the compliance feature enabled, you configure that compliance feature with the list of frameworks or standards that you need to be compliant with. That could be, for instance, the payment card industry data security standard, or something specific to your country, or something international such as ISO 27002. And then the compliance feature will give you a report here in this compliance view of how compliant you are. Down at the bottom left under external apps, we have a link to open a legacy smart event application that allows you to configure event policy, what constitutes an event, what doesn't. Then tunnels and monitoring, user monitoring, that opens another legacy application related to the monitoring that allows you to see, for instance, with a site-to-site VPN between your headquarters and some branch office, which VPN tunnels are currently active. And you can designate VPN tunnels to be permanent, have them active even if they haven't had any traffic moving through them. So you can see which tunnels are marked as permanent, and are there any permanent tunnels that aren't currently established? If so, do we know why? The user monitoring part of that is mostly for remote access VPNs, where I have an individual device that initiates an IPsec VPN connection to my security gateway, usually to get access, say, to some internal Exchange server or something like that. You can see who authenticated over that VPN connection, where they're coming from, what VPN client they're using, and more. This smart view is new. It's nice. It's an web-based interface into your logs. So the URL for this is https:// IP address or host of your log server. In this case, it's the management server /SmartView. And I'm already logged in. Typically, you would have to log in as a checkpoint administrator, just like you do with Smart Console. And this is where the administrator permission profiles come in handy, because in Smart Console, you can configure a checkpoint administrator permission profile that has limited access, limited privileges, no write access to anything. And instead, we have read-only access to the SmartView web-based interface for these types of logs, and that's it. So you can create a permission profile, or you could clone the existing read-only permission profile and start from there. And once you have that permission profile locked down to only permit what a specific role, a specific employee should be allowed to do and nothing else, then you can create a checkpoint administrator user, assign it that restricted permission profile, and then give the administrator credentials to whoever. And when they attempt to authenticate as that checkpoint administrator, they're only allowed to access the functionality that is permitted by the permission profile, which, for instance, may be only the SmartView web interface, nothing else. Read-only access, though the SmartView web interface doesn't really have a lot of opportunity for writing, and only these types of logs. Now, one other thing I wanted to talk about to show you was in the tracking column of your security policy. So here, this security policy is very simple. It has two rules. Rule number one, if it's matched, its action is not accept or drop, it's run another policy layer in line. And so the name of that policy layer is CONT-AWARE, content awareness. So if we match rule number one, we start evaluating the content awareness policy layer, and that policy layer shows up as sub rules, rule 1.1, rule 1.2. And rule 1.1 has a tracking action that the default for a new rule would be none, no tracking. Best practice says every rule should have at least a log tracking action, unless there's a really good reason why you don't want this rule to generate log entries. But if you select log, then under more, you have the option to get detailed and extended log data. And this is pretty much layer 7 data. So if a log entry is being generated by the firewall itself, that doesn't really do layer 7. So if you have that accept action in a rule with an extended log tracking action, you're not really going to get any layer 7 data. On the other hand, if the log entry includes contributions from, say, content awareness, application control, URL filtering, threat prevention, those are layer 7 aware. And so if you have a detailed or extended log tracking action, then you're going to get some layer 7 information. I also wanted to talk a little bit about alerts, which is another type of tracking action that's available. And there are several different types of alerts. The default is don't alert, but you can have an alert which creates a log entry as normal, but also can cause an alert to appear in monitoring. What's usually chosen here is SNMP, Simple Network Management Protocol. With that as your alert, you can set up an SNMP trap to be sent asynchronously from the security gateway that processed the connection, matched the rule that had the SNMP alert action. And that is sent to whatever SNMP manager you designate. And the SNMP manager can then do whatever it does. For instance, use its own alerting functionality to tell administrators, or contribute the alert to some sort of log consolidation product, whatever you need the SNMP manager to do. Another alert action is mail, which sends an email message, and you can designate who the email message goes to. Subject and body can be built with information from the connection. Now, understand that if you choose a mail alert action, every time that rule is matched, you're going to get an email, and that could be a denial of service attack in and of itself. Then we have user alert 1, 2, and 3. When you select one of those, a user alert script on the security gateway that has this alert action will be run. The default scripts provided by Checkpoint don't really do a whole lot. You can edit those. Those are simply bash born again shell scripts, and add whatever you need it to do. And something I've seen some customers do is when this user alert script is run, I want you to take information passed to it about the connection and generate something called a suspicious activity monitoring rule, which is a temporary block. It's not policy, doesn't show up here under security policies. It's somewhere else in the firewall kernel, but it dynamically allows you to block a connection. And so we can have that done via the user alert script. Or you could have it start the coffee maker, whatever you need done that you can do using Bash, shell programming, and Linux utilities. In this module, we looked at how logging and monitoring of status are done in a checkpoint deployment. So how do you get logging deployed, and what are your options for having logs processed? Then in policy, the track column and the possible settings there. The default none, which is usually not what you want, log, some of the options with log, and then alerts. Using the log view in Smart Console to display the specific log data that you need to see using search queries. We also looked at monitoring gateway status, both in the Smart Console application as well as via an external application. And we demonstrated that. So thank you for attending this Jumpstart training.